Hi, this is Sam Fritt, founder editor at Around the Northeast Corner, and today we're going to start a new series looking back at the history of the three conferences that the NECC covers each and every day to get fans to understand a little bit about where these conferences came from their origins to where we have today here in 2024. To begin today's history series, we're going to look at the Northeast Corner Conference, a conference that I have a lot of nostalgia because I grew up in an NECC school, so there's definitely a lot of history that I think a lot of people don't understand here today. Um, in terms of the demographics, the geography of the NECC, it is primarily a conference located north of Fort Wayne, particularly north of Columbia City. Um, it's a conference that's been around for nearly 6 decades, and so without further ado, let's get things started. And by the way, this will be a two-part series. So today we will go through the first 2 decades of the conference's history, and then the next time I will go through the rest of the conference's history to where it is today. So if you're asking, like, when or how did the NECC start? Well, for starters, you have to go back to 1964 with the formation of the Bi-County Conference. Now, remember, at this time, conferences were not what you see today. And a lot of the schools that played in this Bi-County Conference, they came from, they either were new schools or they played in what was called county conferences. But to eliminate any confusion, we're just going to refer to them as pods for the sake of clarity here. So the Bi-County Conference was formed in 1964. Founding schools of this new conference were Prairie Heights, which at the time was known as Brushy Prairie, but obviously that wouldn't last long. In fact, it would be renamed Prairie Heights before the NECC was born. You also had Fremont, Hamilton, Shipshewana-Scott, and Topeka. As you can tell, if you know anything about these schools, they were primarily located in LaGrange and Steuben County. With Hamilton, obviously a little bit of an asterisk because technically they're also a DeKalb County school, but because of the name Bi-County Conference, we're just going to call it a Steuben County school for now. In this case, 3 of these 5 schools, they would become members of the NECC. Shipshewana-Scott and Topeka would consolidate in a couple years before the conference was born. As you can tell, the Bi-County Conference did not last long. It only lasted 2 seasons and was replaced after the 65-66 school year. So now we get to the fun part, the Northeast Corner Conference's early years. So it was formed in 1966, and in that year, Albion Jefferson, Cromwell, Howe Military, Ligonier, Wauwaka, and Wolf Lake all joined the NECC in the same year. Shipshewana-Scott and Topeka, the Shipshewana-Scott Indians and Topeka Bears consolidate. They become the Westview Warriors, one of the most successful, if not the most successful, high school program in the history of this conference. Ligonier won the very first NECC title in '66 for boys cross country. Wolf Lake won the very first conference championship in boys basketball, with Albion winning the first basketball conference tournament, a 78-77 overtime win at Prairie Heights over Wolf Lake. Hamilton and Wolf Lake's boys basketball teams became the first conference programs to win a postseason championship. Hamilton defeated Westview in the 1967 Lakeland sectional. Wolf Lake defeated Pearson in the Columbia City sectional to win their respective sectional titles. Here we go. I had to make some minor changes here. So the next year, Cromwell, Ligonier, Wauwaka all consolidate, and they become the West Snowball Chargers. And right off the bat, they would have instant success. They win their first, they win the first conference regular season baseball title. Back then, baseball was played also in the summer, so if you're wondering why is West Noble playing baseball that quickly, well, that's because baseball used to be a summer sport before it became a spring sport permanently. Albion Wolf Lake shared the first NECC regular season boys golf title. Just as you would see later on with Central Noble, golf was a very successful sport at the time for those communities. Westview won the first boys strat title for the conference. And then in 1968, Wolf Lake became the first conference boys basketball team to sweep both championships, the regular season and the conference tournament. And then West Noble won the first baseball tournament in the NECC in 68, a 2-1 win over Westview. 1968 becomes a critical year for Albion, Jefferson, and Wolf Lake. They merge and they become the Central Noble Cougars. And so by this point, you have a pretty good sense of where the NECC is heading from a geographical standpoint. By this point in 1968, the conference fields football for the very first time. It'd be just like the national pastime in terms of the NFL's reputation. High school football becomes a big sport nationwide in the high school realm, and especially in the case for Indiana. NECC joins the party in 1968. The original football members included Fremont, Hamilton, Howell Military, Prairie Heights, and West Noble. Fremont and West Noble shared the first football title that same year. The first boys track meet went to West Noble in 69. Central Noble, a newly formed school, won the boys golf tournament meet in 1969, repeated the next year, 1970. Also was a very good year for their boys basketball team, winning their first ever conference tournament, only to follow that by not winning another conference championship for 50 years. Great start, Central Noble. West Noble Baseball completed the first NECC three-peat that very same year, 1969. Prairie Heights won the first boys cross-country meet that fall, once again in 1969. Then we get over to the 1970s, and West Noble becomes the first conference baseball team to win a sectional in 1970. That fall, Prairie Heights became the first NECC football program to have a repeat champion. They went on to win an unprecedented 5 straight conference titles from 1969 to 1973. In 1972, Hamilton became the first NECC boys golf program to win a sectional, to which they went to state. Although, for those that don't understand golf, you don't have to actually win a regional championship to get to state. You just have to score well enough to qualify. I believe it's a top 3 score still at that time. And so Hamilton made it to state because of that. The NECC would not see another boys golf team have this success until Fremont did it in 1991. In 1973, the fall of 1973, Central Noble joins the party in terms of football. They add a football team for the very first time. Despite a rocky transition early, eventually, only just 6 years into their existence, Central Noble would find success on the football field. And for quite some time, football was seen as the popular sport, and not necessarily not just the popular sport, but the more successful sport for quite some time. By this point in the early 70s, as you would know from past history classes, you would know that 1972 was a massive year for female athletics. Title IX was enacted to ban discrimination based on sex, and as you can see in italics, in quote, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So basically, to eliminate the jargon of the wording here, female athletes became a part of a normal society in educational athletics and educational events as we know it. A lot of things changed because of Title IX. And without Title IX, a lot of things would look completely different today. And And for that, we appreciate what Title IX brings. 2 years later, actually not 2 years later, just about a year later, the NECC expands for the first time, and this time they go to LaGrange. 1974, after a decade of independence, Lakeland joined the NECC. Yes, Lakeland did not join the NECC right away. In fact, the school had already opened in 1964 after consolidation of its own, and we'll talk about that in a later video. But Lakeland became an instant powerhouse in many of their sports, and as you will soon find out, Lakeland found instant success with the conference, generating an instant rivalry with Westview. During the early portions of their existence, they had won 2 conference titles in their very first year in boys basketball and boys wrestling, and 2 conference tournaments in baseball and boys basketball. Won a sectional championship in 1975. They won 5 straight boys wrestling sectionals from 76 to 1980. They became the first ever NECC varsity program to win a regional title in 1977. That was for the wrestling program. They last won a wrestling regional in 1980. So that just shows you how significantly powerful Lakeland was in wrestling at that time. And wrestling as a sport was fielded in the NECC for the first time during the same time Lakeland joined the conference. We'll talk more about that in a second. With the early 70s came the debut of female sports in the conference. Female sports made their debut after Title IX across the nation, but the NECC would slowly bring in female sporting conference sports into the fold in the years following. 1975, the NECC added 3 sports: girls basketball, girls track, and girls volleyball. Fremont girls volleyball won the first ever NECC title as a female varsity sports program. They would go on to win 5 straight from 1975 to 79. Westview girls basketball won the NECC in 1976, would repeat in 77. It would take Westview 29 years before they won their next NECC title in girls basketball, and as a matter of fact, it would take Westview all the way till 2015 before they win a conference tournament. Now, there was girls basketball played before 1975, but it was not under the IHSAA. It was under a different organization. And so 1975 really was the year that everything just came into fold for girls basketball. Lakeland won the first NECC girls track regular season meet titles that same year, which was the first of 7 straight NECC regular season titles between 1976 and 1982. Lakeland won 4 straight meets from 76 to 79. In addition to that, Prairie Heights volleyball actually found success before the NECC fielded volleyball. They won their first sectional in 1973. Westview became the first conference girls basketball program to win a sectional, a 43-28 win over the host West Snowball to win a sectional championship. The first modern-day NECC girls basketball tournament came in the 79-80 season. Lakeland defeated rival Westview 46-41 to claim the first ever tournament title for the sport. The NECC would later debut a tournament for girls volleyball just roughly 3 years later. 1976, Lakeland won the first ever NECC regular season and meet titles for girls track. They would go on to win 7 straight conference championships from 76 to 82, 4 straight meets from 76 to 79. Staying with the 1970s, Westview, by this point, started to really take off, and especially with basketball. 1973, Westview's boys basketball team became the first conference program for the sport to play for a regional title, where they fell at the hands of Walter Jordan and the Fort Wayne Northrop Bruins, 64-63 at the Allen County War Memorial Coliseum. Yes, the Memorial Coliseum did host high school games back then, and as we go through more historical videos, you will find out that they hosted quite a few high school basketball games. A lot of things have changed since then. Northrop would go on to win a state championship, I believe just 2 years into their existence. So that just tells you how successful Northrop was right away. The next year, West Snowball won the first ever NECC boys wrestling title. They would later become the first wrestling program for the conference to win a sectional that same year. But in the basketball sense, West Noble became the first boys basketball program to complete 4 straight conference tournament titles, as well as 3 straight conference regular season titles. West Noble had a lot of success in the early 70s, but unfortunately struggled in the postseason. As you can tell, they still have not won a sectional title, even in 2024. They're still looking for their very first sectional. 1976, West Noble's Phil Bale was a 185-pound state champion with a 5-3 decision over Paul Harding's Jeff Greer, I believe that's right. Yep. And that was the first individual state champion in wrestling in NECC history. 1977, NECC added girls gymnastics for the first time, with Lakeland and West Noble sharing the beginning title, Westview winning the intermediate title, and West Noble winning the inaugural meets. Combined, West Noble led the way with 7 conference titles in gymnastics. While some NECC schools still field gymnastics today, it is no longer an NECC sanctioned sport, as the NECC ended its gymnastics conference run at the conclusion of the 1983-84 season. My guess is there just were enough schools in gymnastics to necessarily keep the sport. That would be my guess. Continuing the 70s, as you can tell, the 70s were a very good decade for the conference. 1978, West Noble became the first NECC football program to make the playoffs. Now, remember, this is the cluster format, so not everybody made the playoffs back in 1978. Only a select number of schools made the playoffs, and you had to be invited by the IHSAA to make the playoffs. That would later change as you get into the late 80s, but it certainly made it much more rewarding, or in a lot of ways difficult, to win a postseason championship because it was so hard to even make the tournament. Unfortunately, they ran into a red-hot Tippecanoe Valley team in the sectional championship game, and they lost 36-0. Tippy Valley would have a very good run in the late 70s and early 80s in football. As you can tell, football is a very good sport over in Kosciuszko County. The very next year, Central Noble became the first NECC boys golf program to win 5 straight conference regular season titles, already showing the early success of Central Noble golf. And up until the early 2000s, Central Noble golf was a prime sport for the school. Unfortunately, that is not the case today. Later that year, in the fall, the NECC added boys tennis for the first time, with Central Noble, Lakeland, and Howell Military all claiming a share of that conference championship. As you're going to find out, you will not hear much about Howell Military from here on out because they would not last beyond that as a conference member. In 79 and 1980, Central Noble football made the playoffs. They were very good in both of those years, including winning conference championships. 1979, they played Tippecanoe Valley for the 1A sectional title. They lost 67-0 to Tippy Valley. Tippy Valley would go on to win a state championship. The very next year, Central Noble was fortunate enough to host the sectional title game with Southwood. They, unfortunately, were upset by the Southwood Knights 33-12, to which gave Southwood the 1A sectional championship. And as we will soon talk about with Central Noble's history in a later video, it would take Central Noble a couple more decades before they win their very first postseason championship. Speaking of Central Noble, we do want to look back at the 70s boys track program because it is a very successful program that Central Noble had during its time. Arguably one of the most dominant NECC dynasties ever assembled, Central Noble won 6 straight conference regular season and meet titles from 73 to 79. Unfortunately, the program still has not won a postseason championship to this day. And a lot of it is it's just there's always been good athletes from Central Noble's competition in the state tournament. So that's why they've always had some trouble winning a sectional, just because you're always playing the much larger schools. It's a single class tournament. So you're going to have to play bigger schools that have more athletes to choose from. That's just how it went. During the early 70s, West Noble's Phil Weisson won the 1970 state finals cross country meet at a time of 929.4. He placed second next year's meet at 933.6, becoming one of the NECC's first great runners, particularly cross country. In 1972, Weissel won the state finals mile run track meet, which the mile run, I believe, no longer exists today in the state finals format. His time was 4:19.5. So Phil Weissel, one of the early great track and field and cross country athletes ever for the conference. Let's play a game. Expansion. Yes, expansion would happen again at the start of the 1980s. And by 1980, a whole lot of changes would come afloat with the NECC. Let's first start off with the additions. 1980, Eastside and Fairfield, they joined the NECC. Previously, Eastside spent 12 years in the ACAC, most of the time not having a successful run there, while Fairfield spent 10 years in the original Northern States Conference, not to be confused with the modern-day Northern States Conference that's going to debut this coming year. Unlike Eastside, Fairfield had a much more successful run in the Northern States Conference, where they played against more of the schools that are around their area code and their location, but they saw a very enticing and appealing fit with the NECC. And then Eastside, I would guess, would have to do with geography and playing in schools of more their size. With these two additions, the NECC expanded deep into DeKalb County, where previously it was only Hamilton. Now you're actually into that DeKalb County community for the first time, and then you're venturing out to Elkhart County for the first time with Fairfield. To this day, Fairfield is the only school in the Elkhart County district to join the NECC. They're the only school outside the 260 area code in this conference. After the 1979-80 school year, Howell Military withdrew from the conference after 14 years. For those that don't know where Howell Military is, it is in Howell, Indiana. It's in the upper northwest portion of LaGrange County. It's a very remote area. It's not too far from the state borderline with Michigan. It's only about 10 minutes east of Elkhart County. But it's a very small town, and so you already have a disadvantage with that part. And as schools get bigger, cities, expand, and schools get bigger, and consolidation really starts to really round into what is now known as modern day athletics in the educational realm. And especially with how military's political structure being a military boarding school, basically a male-only school, really was a disadvantage from the get-go for Howell Military, and unfortunately, they just were unable to compete with the ever so changing economy of high school athletics, and they would remain independent for the remaining years from then on until they closed their doors for good at the conclusion of the 2018-19 school year. I believe they had been in school since like 1884. I believe they've been around for quite a long time. It's really sad to see it happen, but unfortunately, they just could not compete with all the changes going on with educational athletics and the political realm of education as we know it. Don't worry, expansion won't stop there, because Garrett joins full-time in 1981. Now, Garrett did join early on select number of sports, but they joined permanently as a full-time member in 1981. Garrett previously played in the NEIAC. They've been a member for 40 years. In their second stint with the NEIAC from 1941 to 1981. Prior to that, they were one of the original members of that same conference for about 8 years. Then they left to just be a county conference member, and then they came back to the conference in 1941. They spent 40 years as a full-time member of that conference before leaving for good for the NECC. This move rekindled a natural rivalry with Eastside for the very first time as conference rivals. Prior to 1974, the NECC only had 7 member schools. With the addition of Garrett, that number grew to 10. And the number won't stop there. Let's continue on with the 1980s. Very successful, not as successful as the 70s per se, but definitely a pretty memorable decade with some accolades as well. 1981, Prairie Heights won the first of 5 straight NECC regular season titles in boys wrestling. In that same year, what Prairie Heights did for wrestling became the first of only 3 times in the history of that sport to achieve 5 consecutive conference titles, the only 2 times that's ever happened, 2019 Prairie Heights and just this past year, 2024 Garrett. Lakeland became the first NECC boys cross country program to win 4 straight conference meets in 1981. 1983, West Noble's Michael Major, I hope I pronounced it correctly, won the state finals meet in the 1600 meter at a time of 4:15.49. The team placed 11th overall in the state finals. In that same year in 83, Garrett won the first ever NECC tournament for girls volleyball. So there you go. There's your first girls volleyball tournament for the conference. Then we end this slide on a sour note in 1985. Hamilton decided to cut the football program due to costs and lack of players. At least that's from what I've gathered from research. Unfortunately, this would not be the first or last time you will hear about Hamilton cutting a program. And as it gets to what it is today, we will soon find out that Hamilton's future would, beyond the 2000s, would not go so smooth for Hamilton, unfortunately. Also in the 1980s, staying with 1985, Lakeland became the first NECC girls basketball program to win 3 straight conference titles from 83 to 85. In 1986, a 4-way share of the NECC boys basketball title occurred, and that's the only time in the history of the NECC boys basketball conference to have a 4-way share. Garrett, Lakeland, West Noble, and Westview all shared the conference in that same year. Unprecedented, and it has been matched to this day. That same year, in 1986, the conference debuted girls tennis. Eastside won the first ever conference title. It's worthy of note because Eastside no longer has a tennis program to this day. So kind of an interesting note there. The next year, 1987, Lakeland baseball started a streak of 4 straight sectional titles that would last until 1990. The next year, in 1988, Fairfield became the first NECC boys tennis program to win 4 straight conference titles. On that same year, the NECC fielded softball for the first time, with Garrett bringing home the first ever conference title. They would go on to win 6 straight titles from 88 to 93, and they would go on to win the first ever conference tournament in 1989. Worthy of note, Eastside's going to win this conference a lot in softball. Just a heads up. And then by 1989, Eastside baseball completed a 4P in the NECC tournament. And won't be the last time you'll hear that about Eastside baseball either. Now, before we get to the transition to the 90s, we do need to mention one team that had a run that most people will never forget. So Prairie Heights traditionally has had good girls basketball dating back to the 70s, and the late 80s became a very, very special time in Prairie Heights history where their female sports really dominated the conference, and particularly with girls basketball and girls volleyball, it was the premier program for girls basketball and girls volleyball in the NECC during the mid to late 80s. And in one year, in 1986, Prairie Heights became the first NECC girls basketball program to win a regional championship, defeating Wawasee 60-41 at Warsaw. It's worthy of note here because it's a single class tournament, so you're playing against bigger schools, much bigger schools than Prairie Heights will ever be. You're playing 2 rounds in the regionals, 2 rounds in semi-state, then you have a state semifinals, and then you have the state finals. So it's a much different format now than what you have today with the class format. It's much harder to win a state championship before 1998 as opposed to today. 1986, Prairie Heights, very good girls basketball program. They would go on to win multiple conference championships in a row. From the 80s to the mid 90s, Prairie Heights girls basketball became the premier program of the NECC, kind of in a way that we see Angola throughout most of the 2000s. It's kind of like that to a extent. As I mentioned, the late 80s to the early 90s are to this day the golden age of Prairie Heights female athletics, and I'm very confident saying that because they have never come close to that since. And while it may happen at some point, Maybe, maybe not, but it will be really hard to ever replicate what happened between 1985 and sometime in the early to mid 90s. To tell you how amazing this feat was for Prairie Heights' girls sports, from 1985 to 1995, Prairie Heights won these following championships within the NECC. 9 girls basketball titles, 6 girls basketball tournament titles, 8 girls volleyball titles, and 5 girls volleyball tournament titles. And that's not including the fact that the conference didn't even have a girls volleyball tournament in 1993. And yet Prairie Heights still won 5 girls volleyball tournament titles. This is how impressive this is. And we're going to go to our final slide for today. And it's going to give you a sneak peek of what's to come in the 90s. And by 1989, probably the most important moment in the history of high school sports in this area. The NEIC dissolves, the NHC is formed, the ACAC has to go through a significant restructuring of their membership, and 2 prime members joined the NECC in 1989, and that's Angola and Churubusco as full-time members. Now, it's worthy to note saying full-time members because Angola did join the conference early on a few sports. I'm not sure about Churubusco per se. I did not get enough good information to verify that. But I know for Angola it certainly happened a little earlier. But full-time member-wise, they joined full-time in 1989. Previously, Angola joined the NEIC and spent 30 years in that conference, most of which were not memorable for Angola, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about Angola specifically. Churubusco spent 24 years in the ACAC. Again, not the most successful run ever for Churubusco, but certainly more memorable than Angola's time in the NEIC. That narrative will change quickly, and especially in the case for Angola, they will find a lot of success pretty early on. Adding Angola reunites longtime rivalries with Fremont, Garrett, and Lakeland. That's worthy to note with Garrett, just because those two did play in the same conference together in the NEIAC. The expansion to Busco cements the NECC's presence into northern Whitley County for the very first time, and also reuniting a very significant rival in Central Noble, which they've always been rivals since 1968, and even before Central Noble even existed. NECC grew to a conference record 12 teams. It has not grown past 12 teams since, and more than likely not will never get past 12. This would last for 16 years until 2005 when Garrett left for the ACAC. Spoiler alert. Also, spoiler alert, Garrett will not leave the conference forever. So, just something to note here. One other note here about 1989, the NECC did restructure its football conference due to the expansion of Angola and Churubusco, and for the first time, they bring a 2-division format. And this should be familiar for those that still follow the NECC today. The Big School Division, which at the time, especially later on, was known as Division 2, but for all intents and purposes was known as the Big School Division. That was Angola, Garrett, Lakeland, Prairie Heights, and West Noble. The other being the Small School Division, or in that time Division 1, but really it's just the original Small School Division, and that's Central Noble, Churubusco, Eastside, Fairfield, and Fremont. This would last until Garrett's departure. So that was a significant change for the NECC in trying to grow its football conference by that point. Worthy of note, for 1989, the very first year, Eastside won the first ever Small School Division title. West Noble won the first Big School Division title. Today, Eastside has won 18 conference titles. West Noble has won 16. They are the 2 schools with the most conference championships in the history of NECC football. So, and while you wanted to say that's legitimate or not, that's up to you. Just because with division formats, you have multiple conference championships that could be won in the same year, right? So, is it really 18 and 16? I don't know. You be the judge on that, but still a very remarkable feat for both Eastside and West Noble, which both schools have had a lot of success in football, although West Noble has never won a sectional, and to this day still have a successful run in the NECC for football. And we'll talk more about that as we go along in future videos. But that is all I have here for today's lesson. In my next video, we will talk about the NECC's history from the 1990s until 2024, which is where it currently stands today. I hope you enjoy these videos. I hope to do more of these in the coming days ahead. And until next time, so long.